She was 19 years old, and she had just been thrown out. There was no warning, no shouting, no slammed doors, no last argument that could later be replayed and blamed. There was only a lock that no longer turned to her key, and everything she owned in the world folded down into a single black trash bag and set out on the porch like something the morning garbage truck had failed to take. She had $10 left to her name, and with that $10, she would go on to buy a forgotten fire station in a town so small that most maps had given up printing it. The roof leaked. The upstairs windows were broken out. The county had stamped the word condemned across its paperwork and left the building to the weather and the weeds. But beneath that fire station, behind a heavy door that had not been opened in more than 50 years, there was something waiting in the dark, something that would change the entire shape of her life. And the strange truth, the truth she would only understand much later, sitting on a cold concrete floor with a flashlight propped against a crate, was that it had been waiting for her specifically. It had been waiting longer than she had been alive. Picture her for a moment near the end of the story before we go back to the beginning of it. Picture a young woman standing in the open mouth of a fire station, a tall red door rolled up behind her. For the first time in half a century, late sun pouring across a clean concrete floor she had scrubbed with her own 2 hands. An old man in his 80s crosses that floor slowly, deliberately, and takes her hand in both of his, and his grip is still strong, and his eyes are wet, and he says only 4 words to her: "Real proud of you." She is not crying in that moment. Her eyes are dry, but there is something in her face that was not there in March, when the lock first failed to turn. To understand how she got from that porch to that doorway, from a trash bag to a home, we have to go back to a cold Tuesday afternoon and a note taped to a plastic bag, and a girl who had learned a long time ago how to leave a place quickly. Her name was Della Mercer, and leaving was the first real skill she had ever mastered. By the time she was 19, she could pack a bag in under 3 minutes. She could fold an entire life down into its smallest, most carryable parts and walk it out a door without once looking back. She had done it enough times to be good at it. 8 apartments, 3 states, 2 shelters, 1 group home in between. The addresses changed and the bedspreads changed and the smell of the kitchens changed, but the feeling at the end was always exactly the same. That flat, hollow quiet that settles over a room the instant a door closes behind you for the last time. She was lean in the way that comes from not eating on any kind of schedule, not unhealthy yet, but running mostly on stubbornness, with a wiry strength in her forearms and her hands from years of work that nobody had paid her fairly for. Her face was bare and weathered soft by weeks of being outdoors, more than in a faint windburn high on her cheekbones, a scattering of pale freckles the sun had drawn across her nose. A thin old scar sat just above her left eyebrow, the kind a person stops noticing in themselves, and it caught the gray afternoon light when she turned her head. Her eyes were a quiet gray blue, the eyes of someone who had learned to read a room before she ever stepped into it, careful and watchful, never quite afraid. Her brown hair fell to her shoulders in loose waves she no longer bothered to do anything with. She wore the same 3 things she always wore because they were the only things she owned worth wearing: a soft wash thin cream long-sleeve shirt, loose at the collar, a faded olive canvas chore jacket that had belonged to no one before her and now belonged entirely to her, the cuffs frayed, the color worn pale at the elbows, and dark indigo jeans gone soft and white at the knees. Her boots were brown leather scuffed at the toes, laced tight. Over one shoulder, she carried an aged, dark canvas backpack with a bent frame, and inside that backpack was everything. And on a thin cord around her neck, tucked under the cream shirt, where no one could see it and no one could take it, hung a small silver ring that had belonged to her mother. Her mother had been dead for 5 years. That was the wound under all the other wounds. The original one, the one the rest had grown up around, like bark closing over a nail. Della had been 14. A wet road in the dark, a curve taken a little too fast, a guardrail that did not hold. There had been no long goodbye, no hospital corridor, no last words to memorize and carry. There had only been a knock on a door and a woman in a uniform, in a world that was one shape before the knock and a completely different shape after it. After that, there had been her aunt, her mother's younger sister, a woman named Lorna, who cut hair at a salon 2 towns over and drank cheap wine out of a box every single night and made promises in the warm part of the evening that she could not keep in the cold part of the morning. It was Lorna who had said the day a 14-year-old Della arrived on her step with a duffel bag and a county caseworker, "Stay as long as you need." And she had meant it, probably in the way people mean things they have not yet been asked to pay for. For a while, it had even been something close to a home. Lorna was not a cruel woman. She was a tired one, a disappointed one, a woman who had wanted a different life than the one she got and could not quite forgive the people who reminded her of it. She braided Della's hair the first winter. She taught her how to make a roast in a slow cooker, how to patch a hem, how to talk to a landlord. There were good months in there, real ones, and Della would be fair enough later to remember them. But a tired woman can only carry an extra weight for so long before she starts looking for somewhere to set it down. The looking started slow. It started the way these things start with a man. His name was Vance, and he drove a truck for a beverage distributor, and he came around more and more as the winter wore on. He was not unkind to Della. He simply looked at her the way a person looks at a piece of furniture in a room they are thinking about renting, as a thing that takes up space, as a thing that would have to go. And then the questions started, the soft ones, the ones with a knife folded up inside them. "So, what's your plan, honey?" Lorna asked one night over the slow cooker roast, not looking at her. "You're 19 now. You can't stay a kid forever. Have you thought about getting a place of your own?" she asked another night. "There's girls your age with their own apartments, you know, their own jobs, their own lives." "Vance is going to need the spare room," she said a third night, and this time she did look up just for a second, and there was something in her aunt's face that Della had seen before in other faces in caseworkers and foster mothers and the eyes of people behind counters, the look of someone working up the nerve to do a thing they already know is wrong. Della knew that look the way a sailor knows a certain color of sky. She started quietly, without telling anyone, to get ready to leave. She had a job or the ragged edge of one, helping out a few mornings a week at a hardware store, sweeping, restocking, hauling. The owner paid her in cash and didn't ask questions. She put almost every dollar of it away. She did not buy things. She had stopped buying things a long time ago. When you have nearly nothing, you learn to count what you have down to the last coin, and you learn to know the number, the way other people know their own heartbeat. By that March, she had $47 folded flat in an inside pocket of the olive jacket, and she counted it every morning twice the way people who have almost nothing always seem to know exactly how much nothing they have. $47 is not very much money, but it is exact. It is knowable, And when nothing else in your life will hold still long enough to be counted, knowing the precise weight of the little you have becomes a kind of anchor. There were nights that winter she could not sleep. Lorna and Vance's voices coming low and sharp through the wall, the television murmuring, the box of wine glugging in the kitchen. On those nights, Della lay on the narrow bed in the spare room that was about to become Vance's spare room, and she took out her phone and she scrolled. Not social media. She had no use for watching other people's lives go well. She scrolled through government property auctions, tax sales, foreclosure lists, county surplus pages, page after page of the cheapest things in America, the lots nobody wanted, the buildings the world had given up on. Most of it was empty dirt in places no one would ever choose to live, or houses so far gone that buying them only meant buying the cost of knocking them down. But one listing she kept coming back to. She had it bookmarked. She had read it so many times in the dark that she could have recited it. A decommissioned fire station, town of Ridley, Virginia, population 412, vacant since 1971, $10 in delinquent property tax owed, sold as is for the amount of the tax, $10, just to clear it off the county's books. 2 previous auctions, no bidders, not one. There was a single photograph, a small 2-story building of red brick, one wide garage bay, a faded white number painted above the door. The upstairs windows were dark and broken. Weeds came up through the cracked concrete out front, and ivy had eaten the whole right side of it. It looked like the kind of place a person could walk past every day of their life and never once actually see. The kind of place that had been forgotten so thoroughly that even the forgetting of it had been forgotten. $10. She had no idea those sleepless nights that she was looking at her own future. She thought she was only dreaming the way poor people dream, with the dream and the impossibility of it folded together so tightly you can't tell which is which. Then came the Tuesday. It was the kind of cold, bright March afternoon that pretends to be spring and isn't. Della had been out since early morning 2 towns over, sitting in plastic chairs and filling out applications the way she did. A grocery store, a laundromat, a diner that needed a dishwasher. She had walked most of it to save the bus fare, and her feet ached and her stomach was a tight, empty fist, and she was thinking about the half a box of crackers in her backpack and whether she could make it last until morning. She came up the street toward the house with the late sun in her eyes, and she knew, before she reached the walk, before she saw the bag, she knew. There is a way a house can look at you when it has decided it is no longer yours. Lorna's car was gone, the blinds were drawn, and there on the porch set neatly beside the door like an offering was a single black trash bag, knotted at the top. Taped to it was a note. She climbed the steps slowly. Her boots were quiet on the wood. She stood over the bag for a long moment before she crouched and peeled the note free. It was short, Lorna's handwriting, the loops she knew from grocery lists and birthday cards. Sorry, need the room L. Della read it once, then she read it again, then she read it a 3rd time, and not because she didn't understand it. She understood it perfectly. She read it a 3rd time because she was waiting to feel something, the way you press on a bruise to see if it still hurts. Surprise, anger, the hot, clean grief of betrayal. But all that came was the old familiar heaviness, the weight of being once again a person nobody had quite been able to keep. And the strange thing about that weight, the thing nobody warns you about, is that it does not stay sharp. It wears itself smooth over the years, like a stone carried so long in a pocket that the hand forgets it is even there. She did not cry. There would be people later who would not believe that, Who would think it impossible that a 19-year-old girl locked out of the last door in the world that had been hers could stand on a porch in the cold and not weep? But Della had used up her crying years before in other rooms on other nights, and she had learned that crying was a private kind of weather, and that it was best saved for when there was no one around to see it cost you anything. Her eyes filled. The tears stood there bright and stinging in the low sun, and they did not fall. She knelt and untied the trash bag right there on the porch and went through it methodically, the way she did everything. Most of it she would leave. Most of it was nothing. She kept a change of clothes, a photograph of her mother in a cheap frame, a paperback the slow cooker recipe card in Lorna's own handwriting that she would not be able to explain later why she had kept. She slid what mattered into the backpack and shouldered it. She left the rest of the bag on the porch. She did not knock on the door. She did not call her aunt's phone, which would not have been answered. She did not write a note of her own. She had learned that too somewhere along the way, that there is a certain dignity in simply going in, not asking a closed door to open, in not begging the people who have set your life out on the porch to come back and explain themselves. She walked to the bus station. It was 4 blocks, and the light was going gold and long across the pavement, and somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped, and a man was watering a brown lawn that would not be green for weeks yet. Ordinary street, ordinary evening, the whole indifferent world going on exactly as it always did, which is the cruelest and also somehow the kindest thing about the world. It does not stop for you, but it does not stop either, and that means tomorrow is coming, whether you are ready for it or not. At the station, she sat on a metal bench under a flickering light, and she took the $47 out of the inside pocket of the olive jacket, and she counted it twice. The number had not changed, but the counting was not really about the number. It was about holding something that held still. Then she took out her phone and she opened the bookmark, and she looked at the photograph of the little red brick fire station with the broken windows and the faded number above the door, 400 miles away, in a town she had never heard of, in a state she had never set foot in. $10, a bus ticket to the nearest stop, a place called Lynchburg, with a transfer onward to Ridley would cost her $34. $34 for the ticket, $10 for the fire station. That left $3. $3 between Della Mercer and absolutely nothing at all. She sat with that for a while. $3 in a condemned building was not by any measure a sane person would use a plan. It was barely even a hope. It was the kind of thing you would talk a friend out of if you had a friend, which she did not. But she thought about the other option, which was to stay in a town where the only door that had ever opened for her had just shut, to stand in line at a shelter if there was a bed, and start the whole long grinding cycle over again, the applications and the plastic chairs and the looks from behind the counters, to be for the 10,000th time a person waiting for someone else to decide whether she got to stay. The fire station was hers, or it could be for $10. Nobody would change the locks on a thing that already belonged to her. Nobody would set her life out on its porch. It might be falling down, it might be worthless, but it would be the first thing in 19 years that was hers and could not be taken back. $3 and something of her own was better than $0 and a bench. She bought the ticket. Here is a question worth sitting with if you have lived long enough to have lost a few things you thought were permanent. Has there ever been a door in your life that closed so hard you were sure it was the end of something, only to find out years later that it was the one thing that finally made you walk far enough to find the door that had been waiting for you all along. Della did not know that yet. All she knew that night on the bus out of town was the cold glass against her temple and the dark land sliding by and the $3 in her pocket and the long, uncertain dark ahead. The bus rolled through the night. She slept in pieces, the way you sleep, sitting up, surfacing now and then to the hum of the road and the orange wash of a passing exit, then sinking again. At Lynchburg, she sat 40 minutes on a hard bench in a terminal that smelled of floor cleaner and old coffee, and she watched the other travelers go by, families with wheeled suitcases, a young couple asleep against each other, an old man turning the pages of a newspaper slowly and methodically, like a ritual he performed at the same hour every day of his life. Everyone going somewhere, everyone with a reason to be on a bus. She wondered what hers was: hope, desperation, plain stubbornness. Maybe she thought the reason you get on a bus matters a good deal less than the simple fact that you get on it. The second bus was smaller, a rattling local that wound out through the Piedmont as the sun came up past pine woods and tobacco fields and little towns with a single blinking stoplight. The land flattened and opened, and the sky got wide, and the air coming through the cracked window changed warmer, thicker, carrying the smell of turned earth and pine sap and wood smoke. Ridley came without announcing itself. One moment there were trees crowded close on both sides of the road, and the next there was a gas station, a dollar store, a white steepled church set back behind a clipped lawn, and a scatter of houses behind chain-link fences. The bus slowed at a gravel pull-off beside the gas station, and the doors hissed open, and Della was the only soul who got off. She stood on the shoulder of the road with her backpack on her shoulder and looked around at the town that was, as of about $34 ago, the place she was going to live. It was quiet, not empty, just quiet, the deep, settled quiet of a place where nothing happened fast and nobody expected it to. A pickup truck went by on the road, and the driver lifted 2 fingers off the wheel at her, a small country greeting offered to a stranger out of pure habit. Somewhere behind the houses, a dog barked twice, the way the dog back home had barked, and stopped. The morning light came down warm and gold and slow across the cracked pavement, and Della breathed in the strange new air of the place, and felt for the first time in longer than she could remember the faint, terrifying flutter of something she did not have a word for. She started walking toward the center of town, looking for the county office, and that was when she met him. He was sitting in the long grass at the edge of the gas station lot in a patch of morning sun, and he watched her come the way a thing watches that has learned watching is safer than trusting. A dog, medium size, maybe 40 pounds, lean and rangy, with the wiry muscle of an animal that had been living rough and feeding itself. His short coat was a warm, tawny brown, darker, almost black across the back and shoulders, like a saddle thrown over him. A clean white blaze ran from the center of his forehead straight down between his eyes to the tip of his muzzle. One ear, the right, stood straight up with a small V-shaped notch torn out of the top edge of it from some old healed fight or fence. The other, the left, folded forward at the very tip so that he always looked as if he were half asking a question. His eyes, when they found hers, were a deep, warm amber brown, and around his neck hung a thin, faded red nylon collar with no tags on it at all. Della stopped. The dog did not run. He did not cringe, and he did not come closer. He simply held her gaze across 30 feet of gravel and weeds, 2 creatures alone in the world, recognizing something in each other that neither of them could have named. She knew that look. She had worn it herself in 8 apartments and 2 shelters and on more porches than she could count. It was the look of something that had been left. It was the look of waiting to find out whether the next person was going to be one more in a long line who would not keep you. She crouched down slowly, so she was no taller than he was. She did not reach for him. She knew better than that. "Hey," she said softly, and her voice came out rougher than she expected, the first word she had spoken aloud since the bus. "Hey, it's all right." She reached into the side pocket of the backpack and brought out the last of the crackers, the half a sleeve she had been saving, the food that was supposed to last her until she figured out the next thing. She broke off a piece and held it out flat on her palm and waited. For a long moment, nothing. The dog studied her. The white blaze on his forehead caught the sun. His folded ear twitched. Then he stood and crossed the gravel to her, not in a rush, with a kind of careful dignity, and he ate the cracker from her hand, and then he sat down in front of her and leaned the whole warm weight of his shoulder against her knee and let out a breath, a long one, as though he had been holding it for a very long time. Della put her hand on his head, between the upright notched ear and the folded one, and felt him lean into it. "Yeah," she said, "me too." She gave him the rest of the crackers, all of it, $3 to her name and a stomach like an empty fist, and she fed her last food to a stray dog at a gas station, and she did not think twice about it, because some things you understand without having to be taught, and one of them is that you do not turn away from another creature wearing your own face. She stood up. She did not call him, did not coax him, did not pat her leg. She simply turned and started walking again toward the town, and she did not look back to see if he was following, because she had spent her whole life not looking back, and because somehow she already knew. She heard the soft click of his nails on the pavement behind her, just behind and a little to the side, not in front. He fell in beside her boot heel and stayed there, matching her pace down the quiet street, and the two of them walked into Ridley. Together, 2 strays the world had set out on its porch going to see about a $10 building neither of them had any business wanting. The county office was in a low cinder block building beside the post office, and behind the counter sat a woman in her 70s with silver hair and a pair of reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. She looked up when Della came in, and she looked down at the dog who had stopped politely just outside the glass door to wait, and then she looked back at Della, at the trail-worn jacket and the backpack and the gray-blue eyes and the scar above the brow, and something passed over her face, some quick private arithmetic. "Help you," she said. Della set the printout of the listing on the counter and slid it across. "I'm here about the old fire station." The woman pulled her glasses down onto her nose and read it through. She clearly did not need to. She knew the building. Everyone in a town of 412 knew every building. "Honey," she said not unkindly, "that place hasn't been used since 1971. Department moved out to the new station on the county road 50 years ago. Nobody set foot inside it in I don't know how long. The roof leaks like a sieve. The wiring's long gone. The cellar floods every spring." She set the paper down and looked at Della over the top of the glasses. "There's a reason nobody's bought it, sweetheart. 2 auctions, not a single bid." Della reached into the inside pocket of the olive jacket. She took out the folded money, and from it she counted $10, and she set the bills on the counter between them. The woman looked at the money. She looked at Della. She looked at the money again. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and through the glass door, the dog Watch his amber eyes steady the white stripe down his face bright in the morning light. Then the woman reached under the counter and drew out a form and a pen, and she set them down beside the $10. "You'll need to sign in 3 places," she said, and then more quietly, almost to herself, as she watched the girl pick up the pen, "Lord." "All right then." Della signed, her name in 3 places in handwriting that did not shake. The woman folded the bills and made out a receipt and slid a single heavy iron key across the counter, a key that looked older than the girl signing for it. "It's 4 blocks down," she said, "on Plank Road where it dead ends at the railroad crossing. You can't miss it. It's the only thing down there worth missing." She hesitated, then added, "My name's Ruth if you need anything. Ruth Brandt. I'm here most days." "Della," said Della. "Thank you, ma'am." And then she was back out in the morning, the iron key cold and impossibly heavy in her hand, the dog rising from the step to fall in beside her, and the 2 of them set off down the street under a tunnel of old oaks, just coming into bud, the sunlight falling through the branches in bright shifting coins on the cracked sidewalk. Plank Road was the last street in town before the land gave way to woods and the silver line of the railroad tracks. The oaks closed in overhead, and at the end of it, where the pavement ran out, stood the building. It was exactly what the photograph had shown her, and somehow more. 2 stories of old red brick, maybe 30 feet wide and 50 deep solid in its bones even now. A single wide garage bay where the fire truck had once lived, its big metal door rusted and stuck half open, frozen on its corroded tracks. The upstairs windows were broken out, the frame soft and rotting. Ivy had taken the whole right side of it, climbing from the ground all the way to the roofline. Weeds stood knee-high in the cracked concrete apron out front, and above the bay door painted in white, gone soft and gray with 50 years of weather, its edges feathered almost to nothing, was a single number, 7. Della stood at the edge of the weeds and looked up at it for a long time, the heavy key in her hand, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Station 7, her building, the first thing in her whole life that was hers and could never be set out on a porch. The dog sat down beside her boot in the tall grass and looked up at the number 2, or seemed to, his folded ear twitching, the white blaze bright on his upturned face. 7, she said, trying it out loud, looking down at him. "How about that? You got a name now, too." His tail moved once against the weeds, slow, as if he understood, as if he had only been waiting all this time for somebody to bother giving him one. She crossed the broken concrete with 7, a half step behind her, and she put her shoulder to the small wooden door beside the rusted bay, the door whose paint was long gone, the wood gone gray and warped. It resisted, then scraped open across the concrete floor with a long grinding groan that rolled away into the dark inside and came echoing back, and a breath of cold air came out to meet her damp brick and old wood and mildew and something else underneath it, something older, the ghost smell of smoke and oil and men who had been gone for 50 years. She stepped inside. The bay was a single tall room, a high ceiling crossed with thick wooden beams, the concrete floor stained with decades of grease and dirt. Gray gold light came in through the half-open door, and a single small window high on the back wall, and dust drifted through the slanted beams of it, turning slow as tiny planets. Along the left wall, a row of iron hooks still hung bent and rusted where coats and gear had once hung, the gear long gone, only the hooks remaining holding nothing. 7 came in beside her, his nails clicking on the concrete, and then he stopped. In the dimness at the back of the bay, behind a narrow wooden staircase that climbed to the second floor, the dog had gone still. The hackles along the saddle of his back had lifted just slightly. He was staring at something, not growling, just fixed intent, his whole lean body pointed like a needle at a particular spot on the rear wall, the upright notch ear straining forward, the white blaze a pale arrow in the gloom. Della followed his stare. There set into the brick at the back of the room, nearly invisible because it had been painted the same dull red as the wall around it, was a door, a heavy metal door with a thick iron handle, and bolted above the handle, faded but still just barely readable. In the dim light, a small steel sign. Basement. No unauthorized entry. Seven would not move toward it. He sat down where he was in the middle of the bay and looked from the door to Della and back to the door and let out a single low sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a growl, the sound a dog makes when it knows something the person it loves does not yet know. Della crossed the bay slowly. The staircase creaked as she passed it. She stood in front of the metal door, and she put her hand on the cold iron handle, and behind her, the dog rose to his feet, and the dust turned in the gray light, and somewhere up in the broken eaves, a bird shifted and went quiet, and the whole building seemed to hold its breath around her 50 years of waiting come down at last to this one girl and this one moment, and her hand on a handle that had not been turned since before her mother was born. She pulled. The hinges screamed. The heavy door dragged open against the years, and a deeper cold came rolling up out of the black. And beyond the threshold, a flight of concrete stairs fell away into the dark beneath the building, down to wherever the water pooled, and the silence had been keeping, whatever it was keeping for the last 50 years. Della took her phone from her pocket and thumbed on the flashlight, and the small, hard circle of white light slid down the stairs ahead of her, step by damp step, and she went down into the dark of her own building, with the dog refusing to follow. At the top of the stairs and at the bottom, the beam swung across the floor and climbed a far wall and stopped and held, and there in the cold white light, stacked 3 deep and nearly to the ceiling, were rows and rows of wooden crates, olive drab, military style, and across the side of the nearest one, stenciled in letters that had been waiting in the dark for half a century to be read again, were the words she would never in her life forget. The words said, Civil Defense, Ridley Station 7, 1962. Della stood at the bottom of the stairs and let the small white circle of her flashlight travel slowly across them, crate after crate after crate, the stenciled black letters as crisp as the day some careful hand had painted them more than 60 years before she was born. The basement ran the full length of the building, 30 feet by 50, a low concrete ceiling held up by thick square columns. The floor was poured concrete damp in patches where the spring water had crept in and dried and crept in again across the decades, the walls painted white a lifetime ago and now flaking streaked with the long pale beards of mineral salt that seeping water leaves behind. The air was colder down here and older, and it had the still sealed quality of a place where time had simply stopped and waited. She moved closer to the crates. She set the phone on the top of one so its light threw a glow up the wall, and she worked the lid off the nearest one with her fingers, the old nails giving way with a soft shriek. Inside, packed in neat rows, the way a careful man packs a thing he means to last, were canned goods, survival rations government issue, the paper labels gone the color of weak tea, every one of them dated 1962, tins of crackers, cans of drinking water, folded squares of paper that turned out to be instructions, fallout instructions, the language of a frightened decade. She opened the next crate and found medical kits, gauze gone brittle bottles of pills she would not touch. The one after that held hand-crank flashlights, still sealed in their original wax paper, and another, when she pried it open, held wool blankets, olive drab, sealed in heavy plastic that had kept them against all odds, perfectly dry and perfectly whole for over 60 years. She understood dimly what she was looking at. She had heard the words in a history class somewhere in one of the schools she had passed through: civil defense, the Cold War, fallout shelters and duck and cover drills, and a whole country lying awake at night waiting for a war that, by the grace of God or luck or both, never came. She had never once stopped to wonder where all the supplies for that fear had actually gone, and here was the answer in the basement of her $10 building. Down here, a handful of men in a town of 400 people had stacked food and water and blankets against the end of the world, and then the world had not ended, and they had simply closed the door and walked away, and the cans had waited in the dark for the war that never arrived. But it was the crate in the back corner that stopped her. It was different from all the others, smaller, heavier. It was made of metal instead of wood, painted the same olive as the rest, but unmistakably its own thing, set apart, deliberate, and on the latch hung a padlock rusted nearly solid by the years. The shackle was open. That was the detail that made the hair stand up on her arms in the cold. The padlock had been unlocked. Somebody long ago had opened it and lifted the shackle free, and then, for reasons she would never fully know, had never closed it again, as though they had meant to come back, as though they had set something down, certain they would return for it, and then the years had simply run out from under them. Della lifted the lid. Inside, on top, wrapped in a stiff canvas pouch, gone gray with age, was a thick brown envelope. She drew it out. The flap was not sealed. She opened it and tilted it toward the light and slid the contents out into her hand. They were savings bonds, United States savings bonds, Series E, the old kind, the kind with the engraved borders and the careful serial numbers, the kind a person bought a few dollars at a time at the bank or the post office and tucked away for a rainy day or a grandchild or a far-off retirement. There were dozens of them. She fanned through them slowly, her cold fingers careful on the brittle paper. The dates ran from 1955 all the way to 1968, and every single one of them, in the same engraved official lettering, was made out to the same name: Ridley Volunteer Fire Department, Station 7, Benevolent Fund. She sat down on the cold concrete floor without quite deciding, to the bonds in her lap, and she counted them. It took a long time in the bad light, with her hands not entirely steady. When she finished, she added the face values in her head the way she added everything twice to be sure. $42,000. $42,000 in face value, sitting in a metal box in the basement of a building she had bought that morning for 10. She did not yet understand what she would understand later, sitting across a desk from a lawyer in the nearest real town. She did not yet know that savings bonds of that era, bought in the 50s and 60s and left to sit and gather interest for more than half a century, did not stay worth their face value. They grew. They compounded quietly year after year after year in the dark, while everyone who had ever touched them grew old and died. She would learn soon that the true value of the paper in her lap with 60 years of accrued interest folded invisibly into it came to just over $87,000. But that came later. In the basement in the cold, all she knew was that her hands were full of a fortune that did not belong to her, and that she did not understand how, and that she needed to understand how. So she set the bonds carefully aside, and she reached back into the metal crate, and beneath where they had lain, at the very bottom, she found the ledger. It was leather-bound, the cover cracked and soft, and when she opened it, the spine made a small dry sound, like a sigh. The pages were filled with handwriting, careful and upright and precise, done in blue fountain pen ink that had faded to the color of a winter sky. On the inside cover, in that same careful hand, was written a name, Captain Elias Brant. She did not know it yet, crouched in the cold with the book open on her knees, but she had just met the man who would change her life. He had been dead for 40 years, and he was about to speak to her across all of it, the way the dead sometimes can when they have been patient enough and careful enough to leave the right words in the right box in the right dark room and wait for the right person to come down the stairs and find them. Upstairs at the top of the basement steps, the dog had not moved. Della could hear nothing of him, but she could feel him up there, the white blaze of his face turned down toward the dark waiting for her, refusing the stairs, keeping watch, the only way he knew how. She did not read the whole ledger that night. She could not. Her hands were shaking too hard by then, partly from the cold and partly from everything else, and the light was failing on her phone, and there is only so much a person can take in at once. She read enough to understand the shape of it, and then she gathered the bonds and the ledger into her arms, like a child carrying something it has been told to be careful with, and she climbed the screaming stairs back up into the gray light of the bay, where the dog rose to meet her and pressed his whole body against her legs, and she stood there a long moment, holding the dead man's book against her chest, breathing. That first night she slept on the floor of the apparatus bay. She had nothing else, no bed, no blankets, but the one civil defense wool blanket she carried up from the basement and unsealed from its plastic, 60 years of waiting, still folded into its scratchy warmth. She made a kind of nest of it in the corner, away from the half-open bay door and the cold that came under it, and she lay down in her clothes with her backpack for a pillow and the ledger beside her head. The dog circled twice and lay down against her, his spine fitted to the curve of her, the warm weight of him, a thing she had not known she was starving for, until she had it. And there, in the dark, in the empty shell of a building that the whole world had forgotten, with a fortune she could not explain stacked in the basement below her, Della Mercer finally cried. It came up out of her without permission, the way the worst of it always does, not the pretty kind, not a few quiet tears in the corner of the eye. It came up out of the deep buried places, 5 years of it, the road in the dark and the knock on the door and the woman in the uniform, the 8 apartments and the 2 shelters, the note on the trash bag, sorry, need the room, the long count of $47, the whole accumulated weight of being a person nobody had managed to keep. It came up shaking and silent and enormous, and she pressed her face into the rough wool blanket so the empty building would not hear it. And the dog, who had been left too, who knew exactly what this was, lifted his head and pushed it hard against her hand again and again until she turned and put both arms around his neck and held onto him in the dark. His heart beat steady against her chest. The white blaze of his forehead was wet where her face pressed into it. He did not pull away. He stayed. He stayed the whole time, which is the only thing in the end that any of us can do for one another. He stayed. Sometime in the small hours, she became aware of a sound from outside. A car, out on Plank Road, where no car had any business being at that hour because Plank Road dead-ended at the railroad and led nowhere. It came slow, very slow, the way a car moves when the person inside it is looking at something. The headlights swept across the broken upstairs windows and crawled along the ceiling beams above her. Then the sound of the engine faded off toward town. She lay still in the dark, her hand on the dog's back, and she felt him go tense and alert beside her, the upright ear swiveling toward the window. A few minutes later it came again, the same slow crawl, the same lights moving across the ceiling, the same fade, and then a third time. 3 times that first night, a car came slow down a dead-end road to look at a condemned building that until that very morning not a single living soul had wanted. Della did not get up. She did not go to the window. She lay in the dark with the dog's heartbeat under her hand, and she filed it away the way she filed everything quietly, carefully, a fact set aside to be understood later, and she thought just before exhaustion finally pulled her under. Somebody knows. Somebody already knows. She would be right about that, but it would be a while yet before she understood how right and what it would cost. In the morning, she walked back into town with the ledger in her backpack and the dog at her heel, and she went straight to the county office, and Ruth Brandt looked up from the counter and saw the girl's face and stopped whatever she had been about to say. "I need to show you something," Della said. She set the ledger on the counter and opened it to the last page, to the final entry, and she turned it around so the old woman could read it. Ruth pulled her glasses down from her forehead. She read. The final entry was dated November of 1971 month, before the station closed its doors for good. The handwriting was the same careful, upright hand as all the rest, though perhaps a little slower, a little heavier, the way a man's hand gets when he knows he is writing something down for the last time. Final deposit. Fund now stands at $42,000, face value held in bonds in the cellar box. These bonds were given $1 and $2 at a time by the firefighters and the families and the people of this town, and they belong to them and to their children. If this station should ever close, the fund is to be distributed among them, and if there is no one left to claim it, if this old building is to be left standing alone, then let the bonds belong to whoever keeps it standing. God willing, someone will. It was signed in a small, firm hand, E. Brandt. Ruth Brandt read it once, then she read it again, and then she took off her reading glasses slowly and set them down on the counter, and she looked up at Della, and her chin was not quite steady, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out low and strange. "Elias Brandt," she said, "died in 1985. She paused, and she put her hand flat on the open page, as if to feel the words through her fingertips. "He was my husband's father. I married into this. I've heard his name at every Thanksgiving for 40 years. She looked up and her eyes were wet, and something moved across her face that was older than grief and warmer than it. And I never once knew where those bonds went. None of us did. The family always said the old man took some secret to his grave about the fire company. We thought it was an old man story. We thought it was nothing." She looked at the girl in the worn olive jacket, the scar above the gray-blue eyes, the dog, sitting patiently outside the glass door with the white stripe down his face, and she let out a long breath. "Sit down, honey," she said. "I need to make some phone calls." she made 3, and by that afternoon in the cold gray light of the apparatus bay, a small group had gathered that had not stood together in that room in over 50 years. There was Ruth. There was the current fire chief, a steady, soft-spoken man in his 40s named Holloway, who had driven over from the new station on the county road and who kept taking off his cap and putting it back on as he looked around at the bones of the place his department had come from. And there were 2 old men brought in slow and careful, both of them well into their 80s, both of them moving with the deliberate dignity of men whose bodies have begun to argue with them, and both of them, the moment they came through the scraped wooden door and into the bay, stopping dead and going silent. Their names were Earl and Walt. They had been young men, volunteer firefighters at Station 7 in the last years before it closed. They had not set foot inside this building in more than half a century. Earl walked the length of the bay slowly, his hand trailing along the brick. He stopped at the row of iron hooks on the wall, the empty hooks where the coats had hung, and he stood there a long while without saying anything, and his hand came up and rested on one of them, and his shoulders moved once. Walt did not say anything at all. Walt just stood in the middle of the floor and turned in a slow circle, looking up at the beams, at the half-open bay door, at the staircase, the way a man looks at a face he loved that he thought he would never see again. But when Della took them down into the basement, when the flashlight beams found the crates and the stenciled words, Civil Defense Ridley Station, 7/1962, it was Earl who broke. He put his hand flat on the side of the nearest wooden crate, and he held it there, and when he spoke, his voice came out rough and wet and very far away. "We stacked these," he said, "right here, the 2 of us and 4 other boys, and not a one of those other 4 is still above ground but us." He patted the crate softly, the way you'd pat the shoulder of an old friend. Christmas week 1962, the Cuban Missile business had just gone by. We thought the world was going to end, son. We truly did. We thought we were stacking up the last food anybody in this town would ever eat. And Captain Brandt, he stood right where you're standing, and he said, "Boys, we hope to God we wasted our time today. We hope these cans rot down here for 100 years, and nobody ever needs a one of them." Earl's hand pressed flat against the wood. And here they are, 60-some years, and here they are. Walt still had not said a word. He had crossed to the far corner to the metal crate with the open padlock, and he stood looking down into it, and Ruth went and put her arm through his, and the 2 of them stood like that, an old man and an old woman in a cold basement, not speaking, and the silence held all of them together, the way that silence sometimes can, better than any words could have. The bonds went to a lawyer in Farmville, the nearest town big enough to have one. He was an older man with reading glasses and a careful manner, and he examined the bonds, and he read the final entry in Captain Brandt's ledger, and then he set the whole business down on his desk and gave Della the simplest legal opinion of his career. The Ridley Volunteer Fire Department had been formally dissolved in 1971. There was no fund anymore, no organization, no benevolent society, no heirs with any standing to claim it, because the entity those bonds had been made out to had ceased to exist before Della Mercer was born. The building had gone to the county for unpaid taxes, and the building and every single thing inside it, top to bottom, basement to roof, had been sold at public auction fair and legal, and twice offered to anyone in the world who wanted it. Whoever owned the building owned the contents. That was Della. He told her the true value then. With the accrued interest redeemed today, the bonds were worth just over $87,000. He watched her face as he said the number, the way a man watches to see what a sudden fortune will do to a person, and what he saw was not what he expected. He saw a young woman go very still, and then very quiet, and then something almost like pain move across her face, as though the money were a weight rather than a gift. Because she had been reading the ledger in the nights since she found it by the light of her phone, wrapped in the wool blanket with the dog against her side. Della had read all of it, every page beginning to end, and the ledger was not a record of a fortune, it was a record of a town. It went back to 1948, when a younger Elias Brandt had started keeping it, and it ran forward 22 years to that last entry in 1970, and it was not full of large sums, it was full of small ones, hundreds and hundreds of small ones, each one written down in that same careful upright hand, each one a person. $2 from James Tarot, June of 1951. $1.50 from the collection plate at the Firemen's Picnic, August of 1953. $5 from the Ladies' Auxiliary Bake Sale, the autumn of 1955. $3 from a widow named Cora Hale with a note beside it in Brandt's hand, in memory of her husband fell at the mill who answered every call. A quarter even here and there from children with their names written out in full and proud, because a quarter from a child who has worked for it is not a small thing, and Elias Brandt had understood that and had written every one of them down. The money in the basement had not come from anyone rich. It had been built $1.25 at a time over 22 years by people who worked hard for every cent they had and gave a little of it anyway because they believed in something larger than themselves, because their fathers had run into burning buildings for strangers and their sons would, and somebody had to keep the lights on and the boots dry and a little something set aside for the family of a man who did not come home. Brandt had taken all those small acts of faith and turned them into bonds and hidden the bonds in the basement and kept the book and waited. This is the thing about a place like Station 7, and the thing the people who count only dollars will never understand. A building remembers what the deeds forget. The paper changes hands at the courthouse 100 times. The names on the title come and go. But the brick remembers the boots that cross the floor, and the floor remembers the weight of the men who slept upstairs waiting for the bell, and somewhere in the grain of the old pine and the cold of the old concrete, the whole accumulated faith of a vanished town is still standing patient, waiting for someone to come along who can hear it. Della Mercer could hear it. That was the trouble. That was why the number sat on her like a stone instead of a blessing. She did not tell the lawyer any of that. She only thanked him and folded the paper with the number on it and put it in the inside pocket of the olive jacket next to what was left of her own money, and walked back out into the spring afternoon, where the dog rose from the shade by the door and fell in beside her, the white blaze bright in the sun, and the two of them began the long walk back to the building that the law now said was entirely, irrevocably theirs. Word got around the way word always gets around in a town of 412, which is to say completely and within the week. The girl in the firehouse, the one who'd come off the bus with a backpack and a stray dog and $10, the one old Brandt's bonds had been waiting on for 50 years. They did not say it unkindly. In a town that small, a story like that does not breed envy so much as a kind of collective wonder. An old people's town turning a small miracle over and over in its hands, hardly able to believe it. And then, one by one, they started coming to help. Toby Hargrove came first. He ran the hardware store in town, a wide, slow, careful man who sold everything from roofing nails to fishing line to chicken feed. And when Della came in with a list she had written out in pencil prices she had figured to the dollar, he looked at the list and he looked at her and he said, "You're fixing up the old Station 7. And when she said she was, he did not ring up a single thing. He loaded her order into the bed of his own truck and drove it to the building himself and unloaded it. And when she tried to argue, he held up one big hand and said, "My granddad hung his coat on one of them hooks in there. You don't owe me a thing." And he left. His son came the next Saturday. Wade Hargrove, 22 years old, who did construction work over in Farmville and had hands that knew what they were doing, and he showed up unasked on a Saturday morning and watched her struggling to muscle a new window frame into the upstairs opening, and after about 10 minutes of watching, he set down his coffee and said, "You're gonna drop that and break your foot. Hold the bottom, I've got the top," and the two of them set the window together, and he came back the Saturday after that and the one after that and stopped pretending he had any reason to be there other than that he wanted to be. Gus Renner came too, an old electrician, soft-spoken, who had wired half the houses in the county over 40 years and who looked at the ruined wiring in the old building and shook his head and quoted Della, a price that was a tenth of what the work was worth. And when she said it was too low, he said, "The Firehouse deserves to have its lights on again. I'm not going to be the man who charges full freight to make that happen." And he ran new wire through the old walls, and one evening he flipped a breaker, and a single bare bulb came on in the apparatus bay for the first time in 50 years, and the three of them, Della and Gus and the dog, stood and looked up at it like it was the rising sun. The dog was always there. He had simply become part of the place the way he had become part of her. While Della worked, he would find the nearest patch of sun on the concrete and lie down in it with his chin on his paws and watch her, the notched upright ear, tracking her around the room. When Wade came on Saturdays, the dog would inspect him gravely. The white blaze tilted the folded ear, giving him that look of perpetual mild skepticism, and then, satisfied, would resume his post in the sun. He lay at the bottom of the staircase when she went up, and he met her at the bottom when she came down. He slept against her every night. He had no tags, and the faded red collar was the only thing on him that had come from any other hand. And Della thought, sometimes watching him, that the two of them were exactly the same kind of creature, things that had been left, things that had walked a long way alone and had finally, against all the odds, found a place to stand still. She began the work that summer, and it was good work, the first work she had ever done that was entirely her own. She learned the roof from a pair of men out of Farmville who came and laid new slate and let her watch and ask questions until she understood it well enough to keep it. She learned windows. She pressure washed 50 years of grease off the concrete floor of the bay and sealed it, and the floor came up lighter than anyone expected, almost white. She kept the iron hooks on the wall and cleaned them with steel wool and lacquered them so they would stop rusting, because she liked what they meant, because the building remembered, and she did not want to be the one to make it forget. And the whole time, under the satisfaction of it, the question sat in her chest like a stone. $87,000. What was she going to do with $87,000 that had been given a quarter at a time by people who were almost all dead now for a town that almost wasn't a town anymore. It did not feel like hers. Keeping all of it felt like breaking a promise she had not made, but somehow by finding the ledger, by hearing what the building was saying, had inherited the keeping of. She had not yet decided what to do. She was getting close, but she had not yet decided, and that was when the stranger came. It was a Tuesday, late in the afternoon, the light going long in gold across the bay floor, the way it had been going long and gold across a porch 400 miles and a whole lifetime ago. Della was up on a ladder working at the bay door when she heard a car turn onto Plank Road and come to a stop on the gravel out front. Not slow this time, not crawling in the dark. A clean, confident car, a dark late model sedan with out-of-county plates, pulling up bold as anything in the daylight and parking square in front of her building. The dog was on his feet before the engine died. He came up off the warm concrete and crossed to the open bay door and stood there planted, the hackles lifting in a thin line along the dark saddle of his back, the white blaze low and level, and he made the sound again, the low one from the basement door, the one that was not quite a growl and was not quite a warning and was somehow both. A man got out of the car. He was somewhere in his 50s, silver at the temples, dressed too well for a dead-end road in Ridley, in a pressed shirt and good shoes that the gravel was already doing no favors. He had a smile ready before his door was even shut, the easy practice smile of a man who has spent his whole life getting people to sign things. "Afternoon," he called up to her on the ladder. "Beautiful old building. They don't make brick like that anymore." He looked it up and down with the appreciation of a man pricing a thing, not admiring it. "Name's Roland Whitaker. I sit on the county commission over in the seat. You'd be the young lady everybody's talking about." Della came down off the ladder slowly. She did not offer her hand. She stood with the dog pressed against her leg, the late sun in her gray-blue eyes, the scar above her brow catching the light, and she said nothing, and she waited, because waiting was a skill she had, and because she had learned a long time ago that the more a man like this talks, the more he tells you. Whitaker talked. He admired the building some more. He admired the town. He said some warm things about the late Captain Brant, whose name he pronounced just slightly wrong, the way a man does when he has only just learned it, and then gently, smoothly, the way you slide a contract across a table, he got to it. "Here's the thing," he said, "a building like this condemned no road frontage, to speak of dead-end lot. On paper, it's a liability, costs more to insure than it'll ever be worth, and I'd hate to see a young person like yourself pour her whole life into a money pit, so I'll be straight with you." The smile widened. "I'm prepared to take it off your hands, today if you like. I'll write you a check right now for $60,000. The number hung in the gold air of the bay. $60,000 for a condemned building on a dead-end road that no human being on earth had been willing to pay $10 for in two separate public auctions only 2 months before. Della did not change expression. The dog stood rigid against her leg, the white stripe down his face turned up. At the stranger, the notched ear flat, now watching him, the way he had watched the basement door, the way an animal watches a thing it has correctly understood to be dangerous before any of the humans in the room have caught up. And Della thought very calmly, the way you think a thing you already know is true. Why would a man drive out from the county seat in a pressed shirt and offer $60,000 for a building that the whole world swore was worth nothing? Why would a car come crawling slow down a dead-end road 3 times in the dark the very first night before anyone in town even knew her name? What does a man like this know about her $10 firehouse that she does not yet know herself? She looked at the smiling man and she put her hand on the warm head of the dog between the upright ear and the folded one, and she said the only thing worth saying, "It's not for sale." Whitaker's smile did not move, but something behind it did. Something cooled and sharpened and went very still just for an instant before the warmth slid back down over it like a curtain. "Well," he said pleasantly, "you think on it. These things have a way of looking different in a month or two when the bills start coming. You've got my name." He looked once more slowly up at the brick, at the faded white number above the bay door, at the whole patient bulk of the building, and there was nothing admiring in that look at all. There was only calculation, and underneath it, something that was almost hunger. Then he got back in his clean, dark car, and he backed it around on the gravel, and he drove off down Plank Road toward town, and the dog stood in the mouth of the bay and watched the car until it was gone, and did not relax and did not lie back down in the sun for a long, long time. Della stayed where she was in the doorway of her building in the last of the gold light, with one hand resting on the dog's head, and she looked out at the empty road where the car had been, and the cold certainty settled into her bones and would not leave. There was something here that she had not found yet, something worth far more than $87,000 in old bonds, something worth a stranger's lies and a stranger's smile and a car crawling slow in the dark. It was here. It was somewhere in this building or under it or in the land it stood on. Captain Brant had hidden one secret in the basement and waited 50 years for the right person to find it. She was beginning to understand that he might have hidden more than one. Some things a building will not give up until it decides you are ready for them. The bonds had been the easy secret. The bonds had been sitting in a box with the padlock already open, waiting almost eager for the first person down the stairs. But there was another secret in the building, a deeper one, and that one the old place had buried under 50 years, and a layer of dust and a loose pine plank, and it did not mean to surrender it to anyone who had not first earned it. It gave it up in the end to the dog. It happened on a gray morning in early autumn weeks after Roland Whitaker had driven off down Plank Road with his $60,000 and his cold, hungry smile. Della had not sold. She had not even considered it. But the offer had done its work all the same, because it had told her as plainly as a written confession that there was something here she had not yet found, and so she had taken to watching her building the way she had once watched the faces of the people who held her fate, looking for the tell, the crack, the thing not being said. The dog found it first. She was upstairs in the old bunk room, sanding the wide pine floor by hand, on her knees, working one section at a time, the way she had learned to do everything slow and thorough and patient. The morning light came through the new window she and Wade had set, and the dust of 100 years rose gold around her, and her hands, when she sat back to rest them, were a workman's hands, now calloused and sure, the hands of someone who had finally found a thing worth making. She pushed her brown hair out of her face with the back of her wrist. The scar above her gray-blue eyes caught the light. The small silver ring on its cord swung free of her collar as she leaned her mother's ring, and she tucked it back without thinking, the way she had 1,000 times. And the dog, who had been lying in his patch of sun by the wall, got up. He crossed the room to a spot near the old pot-belly stove, a spot Della had walked over 100 times, and he began to scratch at the floor, not playing, not the idle digging of a dog, at a rug. He scratched with a low, focused intensity, his claws raking the same seam in the planks over and over, and when she said his name, he stopped and looked at her. The white blaze of his forehead turned full toward her, the upright notched ears straining, and then he looked back down at the floor and scratched again, harder, and let out that low sound he made, the one from the basement door, the one from the night. The car came crawling, the sound that meant pay attention, the sound that meant there is something here you do not know. 7, she said. What is it? He pressed his nose to the seam between two boards and held it there and would not move. Della set down the sanding block and crawled over to him, and she looked at the spot he was so sure about. And now that she was down at his level, down where he lived, she saw it. One plank, just one, sat a hair's breadth higher than the boards around it. The wood at its end was scuffed differently, an old scuff, a 50-year-old scuff, the kind of mark a board gets when it has been pried up and set back down by hands that meant for it to be pried up again someday. She got her flat bar from the workbench downstairs. She fitted the blade into the seam. The dog backed off a step and sat his whole body humming, watching. The plank came up with a dry groan, and under it set down into the joist space between the floor and the ceiling of the bay below, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff and dark with age, was a metal strongbox. Della lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. She set it on the floor in the gold morning light and unwound the oilcloth, and she worked the latch, and she lifted the lid, and the dog leaned in beside her, with the white stripe of his face inches from hers, the two of them looking down together into the thing the building had hidden for half a century. There were 3 things inside. The first was a folded document, thick paper official, the ink brown with age. She opened it carefully. It was a deed, the original deed to the property, dated 1924, the year the station was built, drawn up when the town gave the land to the volunteer fire company. And clipped to it was a surveyor's plat, a hand-drawn map of the parcel, and Della did not understand at first what she was looking at, because the parcel on the map was larger than she had thought. It did not stop at the back wall of the building or at the edge of the weeds. It ran all the way back past the dead end of Plank Road, and it took in a long strip of land that lay right alongside the old railroad track, the right-of-way, the land beside the rails. She did not yet know why that mattered, but she would very soon. The second thing in the box was a single sheet of paper typed on an old machine, the letters slightly uneven and stamped at the bottom with the raised seal of a notary public, and dated November of 1970. It was a sworn statement signed by Elias Brandt, witnessed and notarized, setting down in plain legal language exactly what his ledger had said in plain human language, that the bonds in the cellar and the building and the land were to pass in the event the company dissolved and no one came to claim them, to whoever should keep the building standing. He had not trusted the ledger alone. He had gone to a notary, an old man getting his affairs in order, and he had made it law. He had reached forward 50 years and signed his name to protect a person he would never meet. And the third thing in the box was a sealed envelope, yellowed, the flap still glued down after all this time, and across the front of it, in that same careful, upright hand she had come to know better than her own, were 5 words: to the one who stays. Della did not open it, not then. Some part of her knew that envelope was the last thing, the deepest thing, the thing to be opened only when everything else had been settled, and so she set it gently aside on the windowsill where the morning light fell on it, and she turned her attention to the deed and the survey and the strip of land beside the railroad, and she felt the first cold edge of understanding begin to slide into place. She took it all to Ruth Brandt, and Ruth took one look at the survey and went to the courthouse, and the lawyer in Farmville took one look at what Ruth brought back from the courthouse, and within a week the whole rotten shape of it lay exposed in the gray light like something turned over with the toe of a boot. There was a grant, a state grant freshly approved quietly, the kind of thing that moves through committees before it ever reaches a newspaper. The old freight line that ran behind Plank Road, dead and rusting for decades, was to be revived as part of a regional rail and trail corridor, a long planned thing with state money and federal money braided into it, the sort of project that turns worthless land into gold overnight. And every parcel along that line would be worth a fortune to whoever held it when the announcement came. But there was one parcel the whole project needed, one piece of land that controlled the access, the only viable point where the new line could meet the road. The strip beside the railroad, the strip on the 1924 survey, the land that belonged free and clear by a deed hidden under a floorboard for 50 years to Della Mercer. And Roland Whitaker sat on the county commission. Roland Whitaker had been in the closed sessions. Roland Whitaker had known about the grant for the better part of a year before he ever put on a press shirt and drove out to a dead-end road to offer a 19-year-old girl $60,000 for a building the world said was worth 10. He had known exactly what he was buying. He had simply gambled that she did not. There is a particular kind of man, and most of us have met one who looks at someone who has nothing and sees not a person but an opportunity, who looks at the young, the poor, the alone, and calculates how little he can pay for what they do not yet know they have. Whitaker was that kind of man. He had built a small, smooth, profitable career out of being that kind of man, and he had made for the first time a serious mistake. He had picked a girl who had spent her whole life learning to read the faces of people who wanted to take things from her. He came back, of course. Men like that always come back, and they come back harder. He came back not with the higher offer, but with a lawyer of his own and a thick folder of papers, and this time the smile was gone. He had filed a petition with the county. He argued that the tax sale had been defective, that the notice had been improper, that the title had never cleanly passed, that the whole transaction should be voided, and the property returned to the county, where he did not say, but everyone understood it could be acquired by parties with the foresight to know its worth. He came out to the building to tell her so himself, to watch her face when he did it, because that was the part men like him enjoyed. The dog met him at the door. 7 came up off the floor of the bay before the car door opened, and he crossed to the mouth of the building and planted himself there, square between Whitaker and the threshold, and the hackles rose in a dark line along his back, and the white blaze dropped low and level, and this time the sound he made was not the low half-warning from before. This time it was a growl full and deep and certain rolling up out of his chest, and he did not move, and he did not look away, and the message of him was as plain as any words. You will not come into this place. Whitaker stopped at the edge of the gravel. He looked at the dog with distaste, the way such men look at anything they cannot buy or frighten. You'll want to keep that animal under control, he said. He is under control, said Della. That's what control looks like. She stood in the doorway of her building, one hand resting on the dog's back where the hackles still stood in a thin, dark line, and she let him say his piece, all of it, the petition, the defect, the voided sail, the threats dressed up as concern. She let him talk himself all the way to the end, and when he was done, when he stood there waiting for the fear or the tears or the panic he had driven all the way out to collect, she gave him none of it. "I know about the rail line," she said quietly. "I know about the grant. I know you sat in the room when it was approved, and then you drove out here and tried to buy my land for 1/10 of what you knew it was worth before the rest of the town found out. And I know that a county commissioner who does that has a problem a great deal bigger than a girl and a dog and a condemned firehouse." She paused. The autumn light lay long and gold across the gravel, the way light always seems to lengthen and turn to gold over the worst and the best moments of a life, as if to keep us from ever forgetting them. "You can file whatever you want, but I'd think hard, Mr. Whitaker, about how it's going to look when somebody stands up at the next commission meeting and explains in public with the records exactly why you wanted it." The color went out of Roland Whitaker's face. And here's a thing worth stopping to ask for any man who has lived long enough to be wronged and to have wronged in return. What is the real difference between forgiveness and weakness? Because they can look the same from the outside. A man who does not shout, a woman who does not weep, a person who lets an insult pass without firing back, they can be mistaken by the kind of person who only understands force for someone soft, someone beaten, someone who can be rolled over. But forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness is a thing you can only afford from a position of strength. The weak cannot truly forgive because they have nothing to forgive from. They can only submit. Della did not shout at Roland Whitaker, and she did not weep, and it was not because she was weak. It was because she had finally, for the first time in her life, become strong enough not to have to. It ended where these things ought to end, which is not in a fist fight and not in a blaze of revenge, but in a plain room with hard chairs and fluorescent lights and the slow, unglamorous machinery of the law doing for once exactly what it is supposed to do. The county commission met on a Thursday evening in the cinderblock hall beside the post office. Whitaker brought his petition and his lawyer, and Della Mercer walked in with the lawyer from Farmville and with Ruth Brant and with Old Earl and Old Walt, moving slow and dignified on either side of her, and with a folder of her own, and the dog waited in the truck outside with his head out the window, the white blaze a pale shape in the dusk. It did not take long. Della's lawyer laid the original 1924 deed on the table and the survey and the notarized statement that Elias Brant had sworn out a half a century before, and the clean chain of title that ran unbroken from the town to the fire company to the county to the auction to the girl. There was no defect. There had never been a defect. The title was as solid as the brick it sat on, and then quietly, without raising his voice, he laid out the rest of it. The grant, the closed session, the dates, the offer, the conflict of interest sitting there in the public record for anyone willing to look plain as a stain on a white shirt. The other commissioners, men and women who had to live in this county and be looked at by their neighbors in the diner and the church and the gas station, did the arithmetic on their own futures very quickly. Whitaker's petition was denied. The matter of his conduct was referred by a vote that was not close to the state board that handles such things. He gathered his folder and his lawyer, and he left by the side door, and he did not look at the girl on his way out. And that was the last time Della Mercer ever laid eyes on Roland Whitaker. She walked out of that hall into the cool autumn night with the key to her building in her pocket and the deed to her land in her hand, and the old men walked out beside her, and Ruth put an arm around her shoulders, and the dog set up a glad commotion in the truck at the sight of her, and that was justice. Not loud, not bloody, just a thing made right through the front door in the light, the way the people who built that old firehouse would have wanted it made right. It was only then, with everything settled, that she went home and took the yellowed envelope down from the windowsill and finally opened it. She did it in the evening by the light of the bare bulb in the bay, sitting on the bottom step of the staircase with the dog stretched out at her feet, his chin on her boot, the white blaze rising and falling with his breathing. She slid her thumb under the old glue, and it gave way easily, the way 50-year-old glue does, and she drew out 2 sheets of paper, covered edge to edge in Elias Brandt's careful upright hand, and she read, "To the one who stays," it began. "If you are reading this, then you have found the box, and the box found you, which means the building chose you, and the building is rarely wrong about people. I do not know your name. I will be a long time dead before you draw the first breath, most likely, but I find that I know some things about you anyway, and I would like to set them down so that you know I knew them. I know that you came here with very little. I know this because no one with much would ever bother with a place like this, and I built it that way on purpose, a treasure too poor looking for the comfortable to want. I know that you have been left somewhere along the line by someone who should have kept you. I know that you have walked a long road and that you are tired and that you have learned not to expect doors to open. And I know these things, friend, because I was once that very person myself." Della stopped. She read the line again. The dog lifted his head and looked at her. "I was 9 years old," the letter went on, "when the influenza took my mother, and the drink took my father, and the county had no place to put me. It was the men of this fire company that took me in, not one of them, all of them. They fed me in this building, and they let me sleep upstairs by the stove, the very stove you are likely sitting near as you read this, and they taught me to be a man, and they never once made me feel I was a charity or a burden. They gave me a family with no blood in it at all, and when I was grown and they were old, I started the fund, $1 and $2 at a time, not for the rich, and not even truly for the firemen, but for the next one, for whoever should come along, abandoned and alone, the way I had come along, and need a place to stand. The town never quite understood that. They thought it was a fund for equipment for widows, for the company, and it was those things. But underneath in my own heart, it was always for the one who would come with nothing and find this building waiting. I do not know who you will be, but I know you will come. God willing, someone will. And when you do, I want you to understand that you have not stumbled into a stranger's good fortune. You have come home. This was always yours. We were only keeping it for you until you got here. Be good to the building and it will be good to you. Keep something for yourself. You have earned it, but give something back because that is the whole secret of the thing and the only reason any of it ever mattered. And if you have a dog, and I suspect you might, a place like this draws strays of every kind, then give him my regards. It was signed simply Elias Brandt, and under the signature, a smaller line added later in a shakier hand, as though he had taken the letter out one more time near the end and thought of one more thing to say. You were never as alone as you thought. Della sat on the bottom step for a long time, the letter in her 2 hands, and the dog rose and pressed his head against her hard, the way he had that first night on the floor in the dark, and she let him, and the bare bulb hummed overhead, and outside the autumn night went on around the little town, the way the night always goes on, except that it did not feel indifferent anymore. It felt for the first time in 19 years like a place that had been keeping something for her. She did not keep all the money. She had known for a long time that she would not, and now she knew finally exactly why. She kept half. The letter had told her to, and her own heart had been telling her the same thing since the night she first read the ledger, the small donations written out in a dead man's careful hand. $2 from James Tarot, a widow's 3, a child's proud quarter. That money had been given by people who believed in something larger than themselves, and to swallow all of it would have been to break a faith that had been kept for 50 years. So she kept half enough to finish the building and to live enough to make Elias Brandt's gift to her mean what he had meant it to mean, and the other half she gave back. She gave it to the Ridley Volunteer Fire Department, the living one, the one out on the county road, for equipment and training and whatever a small town company needs and can never quite afford. There was a small ceremony at the new station, folding chairs and a sheet cake and a banner somebody's wife had made, and Della stood up in her olive jacket and handed Chief Holloway a check, and the whole thing was as far from glamorous as a thing can be, and it was one of the best afternoons of her life. And when it was done, old Earl rose from his folding chair and crossed to her, slow and deliberate, and pressed her hand between both of his. Elias would have wept to see this, he said quietly. We all thank you, child. And Walt, who never spoke of the things that mattered most, only nodded at her from his chair, which from Walt was a whole speech. The building came back to life slowly, the way the dead come back, which is to say, not all at once, but in small returns. The upstairs became her home. She framed the open bunk room into a small kitchen and a bath and a place to sleep, learning the carpentry as she went from books and from Wade Hargrove on his Saturdays, which had long since stopped being about the windows. She kept the wide pine floor, the floor the dog had read like a book, and she sanded it down to a pale, warm gold and sealed it, and it was the oldest thing in the building, original to 1924, every plank still solid, and she liked to think of all the boots that had crossed it, the boots of frightened boys stacking cans against the end of the world, the boots of a 9-year-old orphan learning he had a family after all. She kept the potbelly stove and had the chimney cleaned and bought a cord of seasoned oak from a farmer at the edge of town, and the first cold night she lit it and felt the heat roll out across the pine floor and up into the old brick. She sat down on the floor beside it, with the dog's head in her lap, and listened to the fire tick and pop, and she understood that she was listening to the sound of a building breathing again after 50 years of holding its breath. The bay below she made into a workshop. She freed the great red door from its rusted tracks and stripped it and painted it back to the red. It had been the red from the old photographs Ruth gave her, and the first time she rolled it up and the afternoon sun came flooding into the bay across the white scrub floor, the dog ran out into the light and turned a circle in it, the white blaze flashing, and barked once at the pure joy of it, and Della laughed out loud, a sound she had nearly forgotten she could make. She kept the iron hooks on the wall, and beside them she began to hang the photographs, the black and white pictures Ruth brought of the men of Station 7, grinning in their heavy coats, the old fire truck behind them, the bay door open in the background of a photo taken 70 years before Della ever scrubbed that same floor clean. The building's past and its present side by side on the same brick wall, and in the center of them, in a simple frame, she hung the photograph of her mother. That was the small thing, the quiet thing, the thing nobody but Della would ever fully understand. She took the cheap frame picture she had carried in a trash bag and then a backpack across 400 miles, the picture of the woman who had died on a wet road when Della was 14, and she hung it on the wall of the firehouse among the firemen and their families and their truck, so that her mother, who had no grave that Della ever visited and no place left in the world that remembered her, finally had a wall to belong to. She gave her mother a place in the only family that had ever truly kept her, and the dog sat at her feet while she hung it and looked up at the wall, and the late light came through the open red door, and that was the whole story really right there. A girl who had been left giving the people she loved a place to finally stay. Earl and Walt came to see it when it was done. Walt stood in the middle of the clean-swept floor and turned in a slow circle the way he had that first day and said nothing at all, and Earl crossed the bay floor slowly. The great red door rolled up behind him, and the late sun pouring in across the concrete. Della had scrubbed white with her own 2 hands, and he took her hand in both of his, and his grip was still strong, and his eyes were wet, and he said only 4 words, "Real proud of you." That was all he said. It was enough. It was everything she had been walking 19 years to hear. Ruth Brandt brought her supper every Sunday. After that, the way she had started doing in the summer, roast chicken and potatoes and a slice of pie, and she would sit in the bay in a folding chair and tell Della about Elias, about the old company, about the town as it used to be, and the dog would lie between them with his chin on his paws, and the years would feel for an hour like they were not gone at all. Della took on small work around the town, the things she had taught herself in the long months of fixing her own place, a leaking faucet, a sagging gutter, a screen door that would not hang true. Word got around the way it does in a town of 412 quickly and completely that the girl in the firehouse could fix things, and they began to call not many, but enough, and every job was a small thread tying her to the town, a little exchange of trust between people who had been strangers and were becoming one, repaired gutter at a time, neighbors. She thought sometimes about Lorna, about the note on the trash bag, "Sorry, need the room." She found somewhere along the way that she was not angry anymore, and that she was not grateful either, because being thrown out is never a gift, no matter how well it ends. But she had come to understand something she had not understood on that cold porch. Sometimes the door that slams shut behind you is the only thing that ever pushes you forward far enough to find the door that was standing open all along 400 miles away, painted red with your name on it in a dead man's hand. That is the thing about old buildings and the people the world throws away. They find each other, not by accident, not quite, but by a kind of slow gravity. The building waits patient and silent, holding its shape through years of emptiness, keeping its secrets and its faith. And the person walks not knowing where they are going, moving forward only because forward is the one direction that does not mean giving up. And if both of them hold on long enough, the building and the lost one, eventually somehow they meet. The firehouse had been waiting 54 years. Della Mercer had been walking for 19. The building had walls and a roof and a history and a faith kept warm in the dark for half a century. The girl had 2 working hands and a tired heart, and nowhere on earth she had to be. And in the end, that was enough. It was more than enough, because a home, she had finally learned, is not a thing you find. It is a thing you decide. It is the moment you stop looking for the next place and start building where you stand. It is the moment you look around at the cracked walls and the broken windows and the leaking roof, and you say out loud to no one and to everyone, this is the one I am going to fix. Della Mercer was 19 years old, and she had just been thrown out with everything she owned in a trash bag and $10 to her name, and she spent that $10 on a forgotten fire station in a town that the maps had given up on. It was the best $10 she ever spent. On an evening late that autumn, she sat on the front step of the firehouse and watched the sun go down behind the oaks along Plank Road. The leaves had turned gold and orange and deep red, and they came down through the still air slow as falling years. The church bell rang the hour somewhere across town. A truck passed on the far road, and the driver lifted 2 fingers off the wheel, the small country greeting offered now not to a stranger, but to one of their own. The air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the first far edge of winter coming. The dog came and lay down beside her on the step, and after a while he shifted and laid his head across her knee, the way he had that first night, and every night since, the white blaze, pale in the failing light, the notched ear turned toward her, the faded red collar loose around his neck, and she rested her calloused hand on his head between the ear that stood and the ear that folded, and the two of them sat there together in the gold and dying light. 2 strays the world had once set out on its porch, who had walked a long way alone and found at the end of the road a place to stay. Behind them the red door stood open on a clean-swept floor, and a wall of photographs and a warm stove ticking in the dark, and above the door, freshly painted, now bright white against the old red brick, was a single number, 7.